All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Y'all doing all right? I had to get my mic untangled there, but we are good to go. So let's start with a couple of announcements and things going on. We'll remind you of. One is remember, MVP season is starting up. We've had our first 2 nights of practice, good weather nights, which were great. And season is right here, getting ready to go. And so I want to remind you that there's always a need for MVP devotions and volunteers, whether that's concession stands or reffing or team encouragers somewhere along the way. And so I would encourage you, if you're interested in that, to talk with Corey Ayers. He would love to be able to talk with you about helping with MVP. Also remind our men about our Men's Madness coming up on March 19th. So that is the Tuesday that the tournament starts, that our NCAA tournament starts. And from what I hear, there's going to be a pig roast. So I'm a little disappointed that I'm going to be in India. So I'm excited to be in India, but I'm a little disappointed that I'm missing it or whatever. So I'll tell you about it later, Wendell. So like whole pig. I think the plan is like rotating it. It's still a church member's pig. So anyway, we're excited about that. Want to encourage you to make plans. Registration for that just helps us to know kind of what to plan for food and everything like that. So if you're planning to come and be there for that, make reservations or sign up through the QR code there. Would appreciate you being signed up for that. A couple different student events in the bulletin. Parent-child dedication coming up in March, and so remember and be aware of those. And then 2 more announcements. One is we have missed it in the bulletin. It will be in there Sunday, but we have deacon ordination service this Sunday night at 6 o'clock. And so ordination counselor for our ordained men, for our new upcoming deacons at 4 o'clock on Sunday, and then ordination service at 6 p.m. in here. Unusual for us to have Sunday night services, but we'll have that in here. And so would encourage you to come and support these guys as they are transitioning and being kind of installed there, ordained as deacons. Several people have asked who they are. Blake Palmer. Blake, are you in here? There he is. Blake's in here tonight, right in the middle. And then Brian Dilius and Josh Jenkins. And so Brian works in our student ministry, one of our Sunday school teachers. Josh is in the fishbowl most Sundays, and so plays drums for us. And so all families that are involved and active and serving inside the life of our church. And so we are excited to be able to kind of affirm them and move forward with that ordination service on Sunday night. So I want to encourage you to make plans to attend if you're able to be here. So all of that on Sunday night. And then one last kind of announcement, and I'll say it as a prayer request, all right? So we got a wedding this weekend, and so Caleb, our oldest, is getting married on Saturday, and we are doing an event here that night for anyone that wants to come. And so just wanted a chance to be able to kind of do a pre-service reception because we know not everybody can come to the wedding. And so everyone is invited. We would love for you to come. You can come and go, come and stay, whatever you want. The times are 6 to 8. Is that right? I'm going to get something wrong. 6 to 8. Okay, thank you. I thought Melody was back there and she left. So anyway, 6 to 8 on Friday night. Enter down at the gym, and we would love to have you come and be a part of that with us and be praying for us. So it's the first, well, it's really not the first one we're marrying off, but the first biological one we're marrying off. How about that? And so be praying for family and friends that are flying in and for things to go well and for me to get through the service, right? So I'm reading, I finished the service about a week ago. I'm trying to read it every day. That way it's just like in my head instead of having to like think about it, all right? So y'all be praying for all of us as we enter toward the wedding time. We'd appreciate that, all right? Let's move toward prayer request. Anything that we need to remember tonight for prayer request?
Jerry and I and Brentley, we're going to fly for the first time to go to just Naples, Florida, but it'd be Brentley's first time, and I'm
Yep.
nervous with him being
Yep. So Jerry, Princess, and Brentley are flying together for the first time, and so we want to remember everybody as they prepare for that. Is that coming up this week? Next week?
It's the 14th.
14th. Okay.
So my daughter is flying to New Zealand.
Yep. Okay.
She's leaving on the 19th, and she's not been out of the country before, so just pray for
Yep. We'll pray for Princess's daughter flying out of the country for the first time. Kelly. Okay. Great. Thank you. All right. Any others that we need to remember tonight?
All those people wanting to get home out of the Middle East.
Yep. So I would just say the Middle East in general. I actually had a friend who was in India on Saturday, was supposed to fly to Dubai and couldn't. Then he couldn't get out of the country at all. And finally, he started heading home on Monday, but they had to go home via Tokyo. So it's actually not the other direction. It's almost the exact same distance from Delhi, whether you go east or west. And so in this trip, though, that means he got to fly all the way around the world to come back home. So anyway, but there are a lot that are traveling, a lot of safety issues. We want to remember all those, remember our soldiers and those making decisions and all of that. Yes, ma'am.
So we've been waiting 8 months since we came here for our homes. We have 2 homes. That's why it's so difficult to sell on one lot. And when we waited for them to sell, we just accepted an offer.
Yay.
If it's the Lord's will, we pray that it will
Yeah. So an accepted offer on a home sale. Yeah. Yep. Everything will go smoothly. Everything will go. Yep. We'll pray for that. Yeah. That's great. Good. Yes, sir.
Our military in harm's way.
Yep. We'll continue to remember our military. Yes, sir.
And there's also a lot of schools that's having a lot of flu sicknesses. I know we've heard
Yep. Flu and strep and a little bit of everything.
closed because of so many out
Yeah.
getting cleaned up.
Yep. So let's remember our schools and sickness and all those things. All right. Any others that we need to remember? Yep. Dan Hennett had surgery and is, I think, on Monday maybe, and is home recovering. So we will remember Dan in our prayers. So, yep. Okay. Any others? All right. Well, let's bow together. If you'll remember those that are on your heart and on your mind, and then I will close us in just a moment or so. Father, we thank you for tonight. We thank you for the chance that we have to be able to gather together and just to meet together, to be encouraged, and to see one another in the middle of our week. And we thank you and praise you for the ability to do that. We pray that you'd watch over our time together tonight, that you would help us as we study your word and study about reading your word on a regular basis and how to do that well. And Father, I pray that you just help us to understand and to apply that to our lives. And Father, I pray for these prayer requests that we've mentioned, just so many friends and loved ones that are dealing with difficulties and illnesses, that you would just watch over and meet those needs. We pray for our men and women in the military and around the world, that you would just continue to guide and keep them safe. And Father, lead those that are making decisions to do so in a way that honors you and glorifies you. And Father, I pray that you would continue to guide us, Father, as we move closer and closer to Easter, that you would just remind us of the blessing it is to know salvation, and Father, the commission that we have to tell others and to remind others, and even to invite others to that same relationship with you. Father, I pray you lead and guide us. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, we are continuing through this series that we've been looking at, how to read the Bible, how to interpret the Bible, how to think about those things. And tonight, so last 2 times we were together, we looked at the epistles, right? So the bulk of the New Testament is the epistles, which means it's letters that are written. And we are reminded when we think about those, I would always kind of put this at the forefront of your mind when you think about the epistles, that those are occasional writings, right? Meaning they were written by someone to someone for a purpose and a reason, for an occasion, normally answering questions or responding to something else that went on. And so we remember that with the epistles, but we are reminded that that was the bulk of the New Testament, right? The bulk of the books of the New Testament are the epistles. And so our order may seem weird, but tonight we are thinking about Old Testament narratives. Just like the epistles the Old Testament narratives make up the bulk of the Old Testament. And so we think about a lot of different places and a lot of different things where we see the Old Testament narrative. And so, again, just like the epistles covered most of the New Testament, the narratives cover most of the Old Testament. And so in just a few sessions, we have thought about thinking about how to apply and how to read the bulk of the Bible through these two genres. And so if we understand this, if we apply these appropriate rules, we see that the Old Testament narratives are easier books to understand to a certain extent. And we're going to see that why. So we start with, what is a narrative, right? If we're going to talk about Old Testament narratives, we need to know what a narrative is. So a biblical narrative is the recounting of a historical event that illustrates God's intervention with man. So it's a retelling of a real event, a historical event that illustrates God's intervention, interaction with man. And like we said, much of the Old Testament contains historical narratives. We got this list here in the middle, and here's what I want you to do. I want you to try to circle books that are almost completely narrative and put a green block or put a box, not a green one, but put a box. So circle ones that are completely narrative or almost completely narrative. Put a box around books that contain a significant amount of narrative. All right, so I'm going to give you just a moment to do that on your own, and then I'll give you the answers. How about that? So put a circle around ones that are almost all narrative. Put a box around those that are a significant amount of narrative, but not all narrative. Biblical narrative is a recounting of a historical event that illustrates God's intervention or interaction with man. And I'll remind you, I know there's a few new people in here. If I miss an answer or skip a blank, the answers are up here. You can come get them. If you're one of those persons that has to have every blank filled, I get it. You can come look at my notes anytime, or you can email me. I'll be glad to send them to you one way or the other. All right, so we're going to work through this. The circled books that are almost completely narrative, okay? And I'm going to read them in order, like down the columns, basically, okay, right to left. Genesis, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Song of Solomon, Jonah. Okay, those are the circled ones. You can already see how, that's a lot of the Old Testament. The box that contain a significant amount of narrative. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Jeremiah, move to the third column, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea. So we have more than half the books of the New Testament that are included in these lists. And not just half of the books, significant books, long books in the Bible that are included here. You look at just 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles alone, and you're talking about large text portions of the Old Testament. This is Old Testament narrative. And so just like we see the epistles making up a large portion of the New Testament, that's why it's important to understand the narratives and apply them correctly, and that's why we start with them as we think about all these things. There are 3 levels of biblical narratives that we see, and this box tries to help us to see that. And we think about this box from bottom to top. The bottom level, the first level, is individual narratives. The next level is covenantal narratives or covenantal history. And then the next level is redemptive history. And so we see these levels that we need to understand as we think about these narratives. We see how they fit into these things. So let's think about those kind of top down then. Redemptive history, the top level, is the overall scheme of man's redemption from the fall to glory. The overall scheme of man's redemption from the fall to glory. Y'all, this is where we started our entire study, right? We talked about 66 books written by numerous authors that span over at least a 3,000 year period, but yet the Bible is one story. It's one story of God's plan to redeem man. And so that's where we think about this big box, redemptive history. The narratives fit into that big box with redemptive history at that top level. The middle level we see is covenantal history, the history of the nation of Israel from Abraham to dispersion. Okay, so the history of the nation of Israel, that's this middle covenantal history. There are actually two covenantal histories. Why is that? Why would there be two covenantal histories in the Bible? Not in the Old Testament, but in the Bible. Why are there two? Because we have an old covenant and a new covenant, right? So in the Old Testament, we have a covenantal history, and in the New Testament, there is some covenantal history, all right? Two different ones, two different middle levels, if you will. We're only talking about one of them tonight, all right? And then there's the bottom level, the individual narratives that describe specific events. Can anybody think of some individual Old Testament narratives? Some of these should pop right off the top of our heads, right? Parting of the Red Sea, Daniel in the lion's den, Samson and Delilah, David and Goliath. I mean, these are Old Testament narratives. These are Old Testament narratives, Old Testament stories. And I'm going to remind you, I'm always try to be really careful about saying Old Testament story and Old Testament narrative. Why? Because sometimes a story, there's this implication and idea with people that a story isn't true. Y'all, we're talking about real stories. These are real narratives. These are real history. And so it's important that we understand that as we are thinking about these stories in this individual narrative way. So why are there two boxes for covenantal history? I actually jumped ahead. There are two major covenants, the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so we recognize and see these covenants in two different settings, old and new. Each narrative is best understood when it is understood in the context of redemptive history and its covenantal history. In the Old Testament, every individual narrative in the Bible fits into the covenant history and the redemptive history. You look at that diagram at the very beginning, every one of those individual boxes is in the second level box and the third level box. We don't have an individual narrative that fits outside of those boxes. They're always together. That's always together. Remember, the Bible is one story from beginning to end, Genesis to Revelation, one story of God's plan to redeem man. And so it always fits into the covenantal history and the redemptive history. And we will understand it better when we understand where it fits in those things. We will always understand it better when we understand where it fits into those things. So each narrative typically contains characters, a plot, and a plot resolution, just like most narratives, right? When we read, we know this, right, from literature. I'm not an English person, like I'm not a narrative literature style of person. But I do remember that, right? When we read stories, they have these things that are a part of it. There's characters, there's a plot resolution. Among the characters, there's usually a protagonist, a main character, an antagonist, the person bringing the conflict or the tension, and the agonist, the other characters that are involved in the story. So let's think about for a second, let's identify the protagonist, antagonist, and agonist in these levels, thinking about redemptive, covenant, and individual narratives. The bottom narrative, if you don't want to look it up, it's David and Goliath. Take for just a second, fill those in, and then I'll give you the answers, all right? So think about the protagonist, the antagonist, and the agonists as a part of that. All right, so as we think about redemptive history, the protagonist is God. And we'll hit on this later, but God is always the hero of the story. Always. Every Old Testament narrative, you can begin with that. God is the hero of the story. There may be some other heroes along the way, but God is the redemptive hero of every story in the Bible. The antagonist, I'll remind ourselves, our only enemy is Satan. And too many times we think of all these other things that are our enemy, but when salvation comes, or if salvation comes, that salvation may come to all of these other people. They are not our enemies. Satan is our enemy, and Satan is God's enemy. The protagonist is God, the antagonist is Satan, the agonists are the saved and the lost, the angels and the demons, and they are a part of many of these stories. We look at the Old Covenant, middle level, the protagonist is God, and it's people like Abraham and Moses and Israel and David. The antagonist is Satan, opposing the tribes and the nations, and we'll see other kings that come along the way there too as agonists along the way, other kings and nations. The agonists are the many individuals and nations that round out these events. The bottom level, as we think about an individual event, the individual narrative with David and Goliath, the protagonist is David. The antagonist is Goliath. And the agonists are Saul, Israel's army, Philistine army. And so we see all of them involved in this as we go. The primary purpose of a narrative is to record what happened. There may be secondary uses of the text, but we should always not jump so quickly to those secondary uses and miss the primary point. There's a reason why it was recorded. It is recorded to tell us what happened. In fact, a failure to understand the primary point renders us helpless to understand a secondary application of the text, if there is any secondary application at all. And so we must be very careful in interpreting these as not to take liberties or to go to excess that run counter to God's intended use for the text, the primary use for the text. And so we do see in the New Testament there are secondary purposes for narratives. That narratives can be a couple different things, like types and shadows, or they can be illustrations of good and bad moral behavior. We'll get to this at another time. A lot of times when it's that way, though, what we've done is we've confused a narrative and a parable. All right? Well, I'll get to that another time. Never mind. I'll stay on track as best I can. So we move on. The form of Old Testament narratives. First is that we see there is a narrator, right? A narrative indicates that there is a narrator. Narrator is usually unseen in the text. We may or may not know who it is. That is part of the point, though, of a narrative, is to not necessarily know. We're being told the story. They are presenting, the narrator typically is presenting God's perspective, not necessarily their own. They don't tell you everything they know or everything that you would like to know, but only what you need to know so that you can be drawn in and see the point yourself. The text below provides a brief narrative of the reign of Jotham from the perspective of the narrator of 2 Kings. We're not going to read that right now, but we'll look at a couple things that you can kind of highlight as you want to there. But what are the important things for us to learn about Jotham's reign? Is it God's perspective? And so we see a couple things. You can kind of look at it as I tell you here. But he began reigning at 25. He reigned for 16 years. He was generally a godly king. He was a godly king, but he did not remove the high places. He continued to allow people to make offerings in other places other than Jerusalem. His most notable enduring accomplishment was the building of the upper gate of the temple complex. His son's name was Ahaz. This appears to be kind of God's summary perspective of his reign. This is a spiritual perspective. Could there be another perspective of Jotham's reign? Sure. There could be a political perspective. There could just be a flat historical perspective. But this is a spiritual perspective of his reign. And so that's what we're seeing as we look at that. What do we learn about the narrator from this passage? Well, we don't really learn anything about the narrator, right? Does it change the story? It doesn't. Just like many things that don't change the story. We don't really know anything. We hear their voice, but they are invisible to the reader. So we see the narrator. Secondly, we see the scenes. Most of the time, Hebrew narratives go from scene to scene rather than following a specific character. And so together, each scene makes up a single narrative. Now, sometimes I think it'd be fun, right, if we could have all of David from beginning to end all in one place. There are people that have done that. You can find those books that kind of cover his life that way. But that's not the way the Old Testament presents David, is it? We see him in a scene, and oftentimes that scene then just moves on to another person, another place, another narrative. Each one of those scenes, David and Goliath, that scene is a narrative. I think that one then moves on to Saul, right? Next, I think. I could be wrong. but it moves to another scene, and we see these different scenes that are together. If any generation should be able to follow that and understand that, it ought to be ours, right? Because we process information in about 30 to 45 second intervals, and that's it. Sometimes we don't even make it that long. 7 seconds, I'm done with it. I just swipe up, right? Go to the next one. That's what we're seeing, though, is that there's these individual scenes that go from one person to the next person, but each one of them is its own narrative. There's a scene there. There are characters. Although narratives may be organized around scenes, the characters are still central to the point. We are not often given information about how they look, although from time to time you will. When you do, it's usually important, all right, because it's not normally there. So that it is there, that it's unusual. It's usually a part of the story, some way, some form, some fashion. We usually have that about his stature, being big or small or handsome or not. And it's usually there for a reason. But we don't always have that. But rather we have information about their occupation, about their family lineage, about their character, what tribe they are from. We often get to know how our characters, how they compare or contrast to other characters by what they say or do. And so we see all that going on. You can see that in Esther. I'm going to skip over that. We see the characters, and then we see the dialogue. It's important to pay attention to the dialogue. And when I say the dialogue, I mean the conversation. What's going on in the narrative? What's being said back and forth? What's going on between the characters? Because the message of the narrative is often contained in their speech. And there are a few patterns that we can see throughout biblical narratives that can especially help us. One, always pay attention to the first point. The first point is usually the most important point, all right? Our culture isn't that way, but the Old Testament culture was. And so we see that the first point is usually important. Always remember the first point of the dialogue. Look for contrasting dialogue to see the point that's being made between that contrast, between that back and forth. A lot of times what you're seeing in the dialogue and in the contrast is an affirmation of the first point that you already saw. All right? And then watch for repetition or summaries. Usually, at the end, the first point is going to be summarized again. They're going to say it again. Why? Because we don't remember very well, right? We are forgetful people. So they say it at the beginning and they say it at the end. And they remind us of this repetition that's going on. You can see some of these things in Ruth chapter 1. We see the character of Ruth, and we see some of these things going on. Again, we're not doing a lot of these. You can do some of those on your own. And if you want the answers, again, come and get them from me. So we see the plot. The plot of the story is usually revealed when conflict arises. Some plots are relatively short and simple, like Ehud, the judge of Israel, while others can have more complexity or span multiple chapters, maybe even entire books. We think about Ruth and Esther. The plot is the entire book. For the most part, though, Hebrew narratives move along quickly. When they slow down, it's usually because they are trying to draw your attention to something specific. So understand when the plot slows down, whenever it kind of seems to draw to a halt or slow down, that's usually for a reason. There's something important going on. We see their structural form to these Hebrew narratives. They contain a unique structural form, similar to poetry, intended to help the audience understand and remember the main points. Remember this. Were the first people exposed to these narratives, were they reading them? No. For thousands of years, they were hearing them. They were hearing them. And so they were written for people that would be hearing them. That's why we have the repetition. It's why we have the importance of the first point. That's why we have the reminder at the end. People were hearing these. They weren't seeing them. They processed this information much differently than how we process information today. And so it's important for us to understand that when we see these, when we're reading these, to get that and to understand we would, be weirded out by a story that's told in poetry. Because that's not normal for us. We're like, why in the world are they doing that? Well, why did they do it? Because poetry was easier to remember. You could hear it. There was a rhythm and a rhyme, and there was a time that went on with that. And so you could get that in your head, and it would stick in your head like a song does. We don't see a lot of that in English because we've lost a lot of that in the translation of it all. But that's what's going on. If we don't understand that when we read these, why stuff is placed where in the story and all those different things, then we'll miss the point. We'll miss part of the reason why they're there. And so we see these main points. The original audience were hearers, not readers. There are structural patterns that are adapted to engage a listener differently than what they would be for a reader. And so we see key structures that seem to largely revolve around repetition, and they include these things: repeating words, resuming the narrative after a detour, repeating a previously mentioned point, using stereotypical patterns like ups and downs, chiasm, which is kind of like a form of parallelism where the narrative begins and ends in the same way, and foreshadowing, where something is brought up before and then hit on later. Y'all, the craziness with all of this is, I mean, you look at how our movies are made today, and they're following a lot of these same types of patterns and things. A lot of this is continuing to go on because of all of that. What you got?
So you're saying that Psalms is music and Proverbs is poetry? Is that fair?
Yeah, but neither of them narratives as far as like what we're thinking about tonight or whatever else. But the narratives would have been written for hearers, not for readers. Yeah. They didn't read, correct. They would have been hearing this. But people would have been telling the stories. There was, again, at times throughout history, there would have been someone reading this to the people, but they would not have been reading it. They wouldn't have been able to follow along. Like whenever I read the Bible on Sunday morning, everyone in the room has the ability to follow along in some form or fashion. They would have not been able to follow along. They would not have been able to see it. And so that's a key to this structure in how it was written and how it was given to people. And again, Psalms and Proverbs, we're going two different styles of literature later, and we'll hit on those in different things because there are some similarities in some types and in structure, but they're not the same as the narratives. So those are a little bit different. Yeah. So again, we see some of this, an example of the repetition in Judges chapter 1. What phrase is repeated frequently? If you turn over there and look, you'll see the phrase, did not drive out, did not drive out, did not drive out, did not drive out. It's the same word. And again, hearing that in the Hebrew, it would have stood out. It would have been this phraseology that kept hitting, kept hitting, kept hitting. And it was proving a point. It was proving a point that they compromised. And that compromise set them up for a lot of problems. And we see that through the narratives going on in the book of Judges. And so we see those things, that Israel did not obey God fully. They may have at times followed him partially, but they did not drive out. They didn't follow all of his instructions. They didn't do all that they were supposed to do. And then we see the hero of every story. I said that earlier. Every biblical narrative, God is the ultimate hero. And while he may intervene personally, like we see at Mount Sinai, or through another character like we see in Samson, he wants the reader to know that he is the one resolving the conflict and bringing good from evil. And we need to make sure that we really see this point in every narrative. If we don't see this point in every narrative, we've missed the point. Stop making application. Because he is the hero of every story. He is the story of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. He is the one redeeming man. Esther is the only book of the Bible without God's name in it, all right? I think most of us hopefully maybe know that, maybe you don't, but we see God's fingerprints all over the book still. And so you can look at different portions of it and you see God's providence, you see God's character, you see God's ways over and over. And so even though his name is not in the book, we still see him as the hero of the story because he is still there leading and guiding those characters, those people. Again, I'm always careful to say character because in my mind I get a character and I'm thinking, oh, well, that's goofy. We're not talking about somebody drawn, right, as a character. We're talking about real people that we need to know and remember. So we move on and think about reading between the lines. Hebrew narratives may include implicit messages, that is, things that the writer assumes people will know about the story or will pick up from the story without explicitly being told. The hard part for us in that is that we are much further from that culture and much further from those assumptions than people once were. So sometimes those are harder for us than they once were. Recognizing implicit messages is a way of reading between the lines. So we must be careful, however, that we do not read a message into the text that is not there. And so the authors of the book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, which is kind of the book that we are using as a guideline, makes a little statement there that's pretty good. You can see that in the quotes there. But for an example, an implicit message in Judges 6. In this passage, we learn about two of God's missions for Gideon, right? Gideon was a judge that God raised up in Israel. We learned something about Gideon's character in Judges 6 and in Judges 7. And then we go back and read about Gideon's fleece in Judges 6. We aren't told explicitly what is behind Gideon's test, but what is the implicit message? The implicit message that we see is that Gideon was afraid, right? We see that with the fleece, and we see that with him as he leads. He had a fear of what was going on. He continued to be afraid of going forward in the battle. I believe it's reasonable to assume that Gideon kept putting out the fleece because he was afraid of what might happen if he was getting it wrong. And ultimately, his desires to obey conquered his fear. And then God was patient through the process. But there's kind of a read between the lines that doesn't tell us Gideon was afraid, but we can kind of see by his actions what's going on there, that there's a fear of moving forward. There's a fear of doing the wrong thing. There's a fear of being out of step. And so we see that through Gideon's narratives and his stories. Common mistakes when interpreting narratives. So we're considered to think about a couple of things that we need to be aware of that are often common mistakes even by well-intentioned people. So we think, number one, about allegorizing. The historical narrative of the Bible did actually occur. I think we've hit this on this several different times. These are real moments in history. We do not need to allegorize them or symbolize them. They are real moments in history. They are a part of the process of God's narrative of redemption. We need to be careful about playing loose with the context. This may be the most common error, and there are several ways where we can do this error. One is the decontextualizing or selectivity, taking small portions of the narrative out of its context to make up new meanings that don't fit with the whole, and choosing specific parts to focus on while ignoring others. Now, again, I told you earlier, we also have to be careful because some of these narratives are really, really short, right? We can get a narrative in 2 or 3 verses in some places. And so we have to be careful, realizing that sometimes we are selectively pulling something out of it. Misappropriation, to misuse a text for a purpose that is outside of its context. We need to be careful. False appropriation, to read into the text something from our culture that would have been completely foreign to the culture at the time. I think this is probably one of the most common mistakes, is that we look back on it with our eyes and our filter and our culture, and we try to apply something that God intended with this because we see it in our culture. And we need to be very careful with that. Yeah.
What if we think that the Bible is speaking to us when it's really speaking to these
Right.
people at the time? That's hard to figure.
Yeah, well, and I would say it is speaking to us, but it's speaking to us out of the way it spoke to those people first. If we miss, and that's a great point, Ms. Bonnie, like if we miss what the original purpose and intention was, then we are going to misapply the passage.
Like
Yeah.
rumors of war, wars and rumors of war.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
that's always, every few years, that's why we're going
Yeah.
to have the end of the
Yeah, but go look at, I would say I can apply that in several different ways here. Go look in that in all contexts. What it says is wars and rumors of war are no sign that the end is coming. It's no sign that the end is coming. That there's always been and there will be all kinds of wars and rumors of war, and that's not a way to be able to tell that the end is coming. That's what he says, right? But we like to say, especially in a time like now, right, that a war is an indication that the end is coming. Well, maybe not. It's no sign, according to that passage, it's no sign that the end is there. So anyway, yeah, I'll get myself in trouble. Anyway, false combination, pulling facts from different portions of the Bible that do not necessarily fit together and then combining them to make a point. And so we need to be careful about that. Pulling something from one narrative, one narrative over here, and then a proverb over here, and then another prophet over here, and we combine them together, and we can come up with a great sermon, a 3-point sermon, right? The problem is those 3 points may not be connected. They may not be wrong, okay? Hear me, they may not be wrong, but there may not be the connection point that we are making there. And so we need to be careful with that. A redefinition. When people don't like what the passage clearly states, and so they try to redefine it to mean something else. Welcome to revisionist history, right? This is the world we live in. I will remind you, this is the world that it has been for a really, really long time. It's not just our culture. It's not just our time frame. This type of stuff has been going on for thousands of years. So we need to be really careful with a redefinition of what is there. And so a couple more things. So moralizing. Some people try to find a moral story behind every story. Sometimes there isn't one. Sometimes there is one. Some narratives only function to educate us about what was happening, God's redemptive plan, all right? I go to Chronicles and Kings, right? Lots and lots of numbers and lots of names. We can apply general principle to a lot of that stuff, but if we try to pull one of those passages out, which again, we could pull 1, 2, 3 passages out and find a whole narrative there. The whole point of the narrative may just be to line up history for us, to help us understand what was going on and how long things were going on and all those types of things. There may not be a moral point to those three verses. A lot of times there's not enough there to even pull a moral point out of. And that's the whole problem, is that we're trying to do that. Fourth is personalizing. A person pretends that every part of Scripture in some way applies to them right now rather than looking at the passage in context. I believe that most of Scripture, I know that we can learn from all of Scripture. I do not necessarily think that every verse in every book is applying to me in my personal context right where I am right now. Right? And so we have to be careful about that. We need to understand those things. All right, so I'm going to give you a second. Let's take a moment and try to recognize some of these mistakes. Below are some examples of common errors. Try to match the error with the description, all right? Yeah, y'all want to do that? We got a second. I'm going to give y'all 2 minutes. Then I'll hit on and give you the answers to some of them. I may leave some of them for you to get to figure out. All right, we're going to hit on a couple of these. We're not going to hit on all of them. Let's do number 2 there. Adam and Eve were not necessarily real people, but are intended to represent humans evolving to a point where they became conscious of good and evil, and God became involved in history. What's that? An example of a mistake. Allegorizing. It's making that story not real. All right, so that's allegorizing. Let's jump down. Let's see what number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Number 5. The men of the Bible times were much more effeminate because they wore robes instead of pants. We laugh. I've heard worse. I'm just telling you, I've heard worse. It's a false appropriation. It's a misunderstanding of culture. It's a false appropriation, not understanding all that is going on there. And let's do the one right above it. Because Judges 1:8 says that the Israelites captured the city of Jerusalem, The narrative of 2 Samuel 5, 6 and 7 describing David's culture of Jerusalem must mean that they lost the city at some point and recaptured it. False combination. Maybe, but we're taking two different places by two different writers and combining them together to try to say that this is what happened. Maybe. There are resources that we can use to help us understand those things and histories and timelines and those types of things. But we need to be careful about taking those places apart from one another and not understanding how they always fit there. And we see the little bolded statement there at the beginning, or there at the end, I think is good for us. Just because a narrative's teaching is not clearly stated, it doesn't mean that it is a secret. Make sure you pay close attention to what a narrative tells you, not what it doesn't tell you, and prayerfully discern the implied message. Y'all, Old Testament narratives are rich for us. They are rich for us to be able to understand who God is, what his character is, how he works in people's lives, that he interacts and works in people's lives. And we need to hold on to those. I worry sometimes that we have lost sight of what those are, that we understand the importance of them, that we remember the stories of them in detail, right? I'm one of those weird ones. Like, I don't like telling the story of David and Goliath without telling the part where he, cuts off Goliath's head. Like, that's a gory, bloody part of the story, right? But I think it's there for a reason. I think it's there for a purpose. And we need to hold on to those and understand that they're important and that they're good and that they're real. And so that would be my encouragement for you. Read them, enjoy them, see them, look for the meaning there. Apply the meaning that the hearers would have heard. Apply that meaning into our life and understand who God is. So many times it is reminding the people of God's faithfulness, God's holiness, God's justice. And those are things that we need to be reminded of on a regular basis. And we see that over and over through these Old Testament narratives. And so I would remind you and encourage you to